June 30th, 2026. Well, some developments are occurring outside of the whole issue we've been discussing about the conflict with Iran that I think are very disturbing and actually far more dangerous for everybody involved. And basically, going back to the situation in Ukraine and what's going on, I think, inside of Russia right now may be heading in a very bad direction. And there's several things I need to go through, and they're kind of intermixed with each other. One thing to consider is the fact that it's recently been announced, in fact, one thing that both the Russian government with the foreign minister and our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, both seem to agree on, is that the plans toward peace that were announced in Alaska last year as part of the meeting between Trump and Putin are off the table, apparently. Both sides agree on this. At the same time, the hostility in Western Europe and the NATO countries toward Russia is growing, and the talk of preparing for war has increased. Okay. And it seems like at this point, it's kind of become a consensus of everybody involved on both sides that peace is not possible. Of course, this has been met with the G7 summit and apparently a signal to increase attacks on Russian infrastructure. So all this is coming together at the same time. A very senior person on the Russian Foreign Policy Council, Sergei Komarganov, and he's basically advocating the actual attack on a series of factories in Western Europe that are producing the components of the Ukrainian drones that are causing so much publicized havoc. And that if that is not effective of dissuading NATO to actually go to tactical nuclear strikes, which sounds pretty radical to me. But when you have somebody who's kind of at the level of, well, I don't think it's quite the level of what, say, Kissinger was back in the old days, but this is a very influential individual. And that is a pretty radical statement. And I would distinguish that between the kind of things we've heard in the past from Medvedev, which were, I think, irrational comments, and like bombing specific large cities in NATO countries. That's kind of crazy stuff. And therefore, it wasn't taken too seriously. And in fact, this guy's basic critique is that the Russians have simply lost all deterrent capability or credibility because of their inaction in the face of a lot of attacks on their own country. And while it's being done through surrogates, the surrogate, that is, of Ukraine, we all know that, in fact, it's United States intelligence, British intelligence, and our Starlink satellite system that is absolutely integral to the attacks, as well as who knows what else. Certain contractors, no doubt, are definitely assisting in all this as well. So, and given the fact that negotiations are now off the table, then Russia has to figure out where they're going next. And since their perspective on this war is totally different than it's being portrayed in the West, I think, at least in the leadership circles, this doesn't bode well for peace, let's put it that way. So, at any rate, that's kind of the situation I'm very concerned about. Add to it that a really interesting series of developments have occurred lately, which are kind of notable. First of all, on I think it was June the 6th, that Ukraine carried out a series of drone attacks, I believe, actually going through NATO countries, the Baltic states, to attack St. Petersburg and the oil facilities there. That was also right during an international conference that the Russians were having to try to create kind of a humiliation for Putin. And remember that at some point he's going to react to this. Okay, on June the 15th, the Russians conducted their last large-scale drone and missile attack on Kyiv, which was then followed the day later by a large drone attack on Moscow, which occurred on the 16th, and then there was a follow-up strike, I think, on the 18th, which ended up destroying the Moscow oil refiner, at least so totally putting it out of action that it won't be producing for a while, to say the least. And and then there's other strikes. So this has created a gasoline shortage inside of Russia. Now, what's interesting about this is that and notable is there wasn't at this time, as of this recording, um, any kind of large scale Russian response to this at all. Usually, you'd expect within a few days. For instance, the one on St. Petersburg was followed up, I guess, 9 days later by another attack on Kiev, and some days have passed since the 16th there, and there hasn't, as of this recording, a large scale attack. Of course, one may occur by the time you see this, and it'll make this look kind of wrong thinking, but I'm kind of like, well, that's interesting, because obviously they do have a lot of drones and could have carried out one by now, but they didn't. Other developments are occurring also that's interesting is that there was an ultimatum issued by Ukraine against Belarus to remove certain transmitters that they've been using to guide their drones for attacks into western Ukraine. And well, I don't know. It's hard to know what's happened. It sounds to me like that at least they've turned these things off and they haven't utilized them since that time. Because there are strategic reasons why Russia wouldn't want that to occur. There was also a meeting also between Putin and the president of Belarus. So after that, so we don't know what's going on there. Of course, it should be noted also that tactical nuclear weapons have been deployed into Belarus previously last year. So that is a point to consider. At any rate. At the moment, nothing's happened there, and so finally, at about the time when everybody was thinking, well, okay, this is about when the Russian big attack on Kyiv is going to occur again. Instead, apparently, word came out that in fact the aircraft that would launch missiles were actually involved in a training exercise, in I guess out in Siberia. So basically, this attack apparently was postponed or called off for a while, at least in order to do a training exercise of some type. So we don't know what's actually brewing here, but I look at the signs of, quiet from your adversary sometimes becomes a little bit threatening, particularly in the environment that we're talking about as I've led into this. So anyway, just to keep you informed of what I'm worried about, I'll go into a bit more detail what else is going on. If you like these videos, please give me a like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and also you can follow me on Rumble because I post there as well. Now, so, okay, that's the lead up. Now, what actually has been happening since then is kind of interesting. A real change in Russian strategy, it seems like. They've been focused on basically bombing, doing drone attacks on gasoline stations. Your ordinary local gas station, I guess Ukraine style, are being hit by drones. And of course, one aspect of this is that Russian drone attacks have dropped off to around 100 a day. So you're not looking at these massive 600, 700 drone attacks. None of them are really occurring in western Ukraine for the reason maybe we already discussed earlier. But they are going after the gasoline stations that are needed for the military transport to do logistics to send supplies to the front. And there's certainly a big offensive that Russia is launching in the Kharkiv area, in the up near the I guess you'd call it the northeast corner of Ukraine. And if successful, it could make it very difficult for trucks to both drive up there and then drive back, if you will. Plus, remember, trucks are often used to bring the drones to the launch points, and they seem to be engaged in a policy to basically destroy all the gasoline stations in that sort of northeastern area of Ukraine. To basically, in other words, instead of going after oil refineries, they're just going after gasoline stations one by one. Interesting. And it looks like, well, we'll see if that policy can be successful, but it does seem like maybe the later Ukrainian drone attacks haven't penetrated quite as deep, with the possible exception of a few Flamingo cruise missiles that they're self-made by Ukraine, with, again, private parts from Western Europe. So anyhow, that seems to be what's actually been developing. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, essentially, Russia's pretty much continuing to continue their ground offensive all the way around the front, from the northern areas all the way into Kherson. I mean, for the most part, um, it seems like the ground war is still going relatively favorable in Russia's direction, but relatively slowly. But but essentially Russia's in the process of taking the fortified cities in the Donbass, which basically protect the rest of that area. Once you take those fortified cities, you're basically into mostly open territory, which is kind of drone country, if you will. So I don't know that some claims have been made that Russia has a goal of taking all of Donbass by the fall. Whether that can happen or not, I don't know. But they may be able to take these fortified cities by that time and be breaking into the open area. Of course, moving to that open area, it can be somewhat difficult. And of course, as has been talked a lot, there's been a lot of drone activity in the Zaporizhia and Kherson areas to try to disrupt Russian logistics. And so both sides are kind of trying to starve each other out with logistical strikes. So at any rate, I'm just kind of laying up. I don't know what's coming next. One thing is the issue of how, if Russia was to carry out this strategist plan, how would they actually launch these attacks against these sites in Western Europe? Because, I mean, after all, the distances are great, and Russian tactical aircraft have not been able to operate freely over Ukraine. So do they think they could really operate freely over the NATO countries, given the capability of NATO air forces? Which, when you listen to some of these, you basically got two schools of thought out there. The Western school of thought is Russia's losing, and then you listen to guys like these let's call them the alternative viewpoint, let's say, people on the Napolitano show and Daniel Davis and these kind of guys overinflate Russia's capabilities a lot too. I think that they think Russia's in a better position, at least than I think they're in. And in fact, them being in a somewhat bad position may make them even more dangerous, actually. If they were confident in winning with what they're doing now, then all I'm talking about probably wouldn't be an issue. But if they're not confident, that's where the thing gets rather hairy. And so one possibility is the whole Oreshnik situation, this missile that they've come up with and have been used, I think, on 4 occasions, and 3 of which, as far as I can see, were successful attacks. What the damage was has been concealed from us because the Ukrainians don't show it to us. And so we don't know. And one of them, the local Ukrainian mayor, I think, said that the airfield there had been pretty well devastated. The other 2, we just don't know. One was an attack on a big industrial plant that made missiles historically. And the other one was an attack on an unknown facility that was near Kyiv, but not in the city. The failure, as I mentioned previously, is, well, was it a failure or a test? Putin has actually stated that the Oreshnik was never tested inside of Russian territory. All the tests have been done on Ukrainian territory. If this is true, and most of these missiles have been launched from their test facility, so it would seem like that maybe that's the situation. Now, one critic has claimed that Russia only has 1 Oreshnik missile left, in which case I guess the threat it poses is pretty minimal, I would think. On the other hand, if that's totally false, which often these claims tend to be, if they have an arsenal of these, this might be the exact kind of weapon they might attack these factories with, because there would be no practical air defense against them, and these 36 projectiles would come crashing down on the factory and probably just tear it to pieces, right? And so they could definitely carry out these strikes. They would be conventional in nature, no nuclear weapon, and they could destroy a factory or 2 or 3 or 4 maybe. I don't know. That leads to what would the NATO reaction be to that, of course. And there we get into a whole different, kind of scenario. So this is one thing that could be in the offing if they're planning on doing anything. The other issue is all these drones they're storing up. I mean, they could plan on launching some kind of a drone attack against maybe various logistic facilities that are used to ship things into Ukraine, perhaps in Poland, or maybe some of the Baltic states. Certainly, they could definitely move across Belarus into the Baltic states, I guess. And this gives you an idea of what could be in the offing. And of course, this could lead to a war. that's the bottom line here, and that's not a good situation, because as this Sorganov has mentioned, if this doesn't work, the next step is tactical nuclear weapons. And I've long pointed out that I think that a war between NATO and Russia, if it's a serious war, is going to have to go nuclear, because I don't think Russia has any real ability to deal with Western air power in a conventional level, ultimately, at this point. Particularly, a lot of their air defenses that they had back in the beginning of this conflict in 2022 have been used up in and all this fighting with all these drone attacks. So, and as you can see, that Russia is pretty well wide open to attack, and Peskov, who's their press secretary for Putin, basically for the government, the executive branch there, has said that basically the nuclear after saying a lot of nice, kind of diplomatic words at the end, basically indicated that their nuclear deterrent is their only real asset that they can only rely on. See, and that's why I think this is shifting in a kind of a combination of everything I've said here is shifting in kind of a dangerous direction. And I don't know what's going to actually happen, but we would have to point out that, for instance, the years leading up to the 2020 incursion into Ukraine were preceded by 8 years of Russia trying to talk to the West and expressing their concerns about what was going on in Ukraine and trying to negotiate something. And of course, that the Minsk agreements were all kind of a farce, and ultimately the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, former Chancellor, actually said the whole thing was a deception campaign. So at this point, you see, we're getting down to the point where action seems to be necessary on the Russian part. And I don't think capitulation is something they want to consider, because unlike the way the West sees it, is that the whole thing of moving into Ukraine is kind of an issue of acquisition, or issue of taking what is not theirs. From their point of view, it's a defensive move to actually occupy, to create a security barrier. Israel considers their action in Lebanon in that context, if you will, right? Similarly, Russia sees this one the same way. And I'm pretty sure their leadership does see it that way. Whether we agree with this or not, or whether we're willing to accept this or not, is another issue. That's what they're basing it on. And their ultimate fear, obviously, is that, NATO weapons deployed into Ukraine, where these drones are now being launched, could be very accurate ballistic missiles. Remember, a good part of their strategic nuclear forces are located in that area of Russia, not off in Siberia. And so you can see how this is just completely unacceptable to them. And whether we like it or not, they're likely to do something dangerous. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know what it's going to be or when it's going to be, but it seems to me like the escalation could come fairly sharply if it were to occur. I personally think that I don't know, if they have enough Oreshniks to actually conduct the campaign against these sites, is one thing to think about. I generally think that's a futile thing, as I mentioned in a previous video at the end. That the West, including the United States, has plenty of places we can build components for drones, and in my opinion is that trying to actually destroy these factories is a futile effort. It'd be more useful to actually try to destroy factories in Ukraine where they're all being assembled, rather than trying to get where the components are being made, which would be more diversified, and so. Any such attack is more of a kind of a symbolic nature, I think, in order to simply shock the system a little bit. And I've felt, and I hope that none of this happens. Okay, I'm really hoping that none of this happens. But I would suggest, if I were advising them as one of them, which I'm not, I would say that the attack on a NATO country would invoke Article 5 and would definitely lead to a naval blockade, I think, of all their oil shipments, at least on the Atlantic side. So my general thought is that a more effective tactic would be to start using tactical nuclear weapons inside of Ukraine against legitimate and usable military targets, not just symbolically, but I mentioned the idea of a bridge that's hard to knock out with conventional weapons could easily be knocked out with one nuclear weapon, for example. And the very fact that they're using nuclear weapons would signal ahead of time that any war with Russia would be a nuclear war. And I think that would cool the heels a little bit. Because even if they thought they would, quote, win it, haven't they been saying for years that nuclear wars are unwinnable? Do you see what I mean? And I think if they realized from the outset that that engagement would quickly go into tactical nuclear weapons, and that's an area where the Russians are a little bit ahead of us, actually. Basically, the NATO deployment of tactical nuclear weapons consists entirely of gravity bombs to be delivered by fighter bombers or the B-2 for that matter, And of course, or we of course have strategic weapons, which are part of our strategic arsenal. We could use some of the cruise missiles that we have in the stockpile, which are tactically, of course, launched from a B-52, for instance. But that would be moving planes from the U.S. into the theater, of course. That would be kind of obvious, too, I think, if that was happening. And, of course, I don't know. That would get into, I think, rather quickly, probably would escalate into a full-scale war, which would probably destroy both sides or do unacceptable damage. I think we could get into what that would be. So what I'm getting at is I think that strategy would be superior from their point of view, and it wouldn't immediately invoke a war with NATO. What it would do is it would invoke a situation where NATO and the U.S. would have to sit back and have a strategy session and figure out what we're really going to do now. Because I don't think they were counting on this, is what we were counting on this. I don't think we were. And if that were to happen. Whereas directly attacking a NATO country, I think, as I've said, would lead to naval actions particularly. And maybe air actions as well. Who knows? Maybe a ground invasion from Finland. I mean, try to take St. Petersburg, huh? I don't know. That you see, it all depends on just how motivated all these outfits are to do these things. But at any rate, that's kind of what I have for the moment. I'm kind of hoping that none of this happens. But I don't see that the current, there's even a discussion that Trump may want to actually get more involved in this Ukraine thing as a distraction, if you will, from how the Iran war worked out. That was great, let's go into Iran doesn't work good, so let's go into Russia. But but that is the problem we're looking at here, and we'll see. I don't know that that's true or not. I think that Trump's original peace plan of last year was defeated by the Ukrainians and European resistance to it, and all the hawks in the United States that want to pursue this thing. But it's mainly, I think, the Europeans were most critical in that whole effort. And anyhow, and now, okay, we're in the situation where what's next? It looks like, we've got a lot of things going on. The other issue is interesting also, what the Chinese reaction to all this would be. One outcome of the Iran conflict is, and the naval blockade was fairly successful compared to everything else. And what that definitely indicates to the Chinese, if they're going to do anything significantly aggressive against our allies in the Pacific, they probably would be faced with a naval blockade of oil shipments from Iran and the Middle East, right? And they've already lost Venezuela, so Russia becomes a much more significant thing for them in terms of energy, of oil and natural gas, right? And so that's a thing that has to be considered too from their point of view. Can China afford to let Russia lose? If so, what kind of position? Then they're all alone. You see what I mean? So the Chinese, I don't know. They've not done a lot yet, but it's interesting to see what their ultimate reaction to this will be. Anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking of right now. It's all kind of gloomy, and I'm not too happy about any of it, because the last thing I'd really want to do is see this NATO-Russia war happen, particularly since it has such a strong nuclear component to it. And so anyhow, bad news in my opinion, but we'll see. Maybe this is all just gloom on my own part, what I've been thinking lately. And the year is half over, so at any rate, I'll be posting this on YouTube and Rumble, as always, and the addresses of my social media accounts are in the description below. So all for this time.